Edward observed the activity around him with slight discomfort. The charity event he was attending felt like something outside of his reality. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, casting a soft glow across every corner of the grand hall. The people around him seemed almost otherworldly, men in tailored suits and women in expensive gowns, exchanging smiles and handshakes as if they were all long-time acquaintances. But Edward felt out of place. He had never been a part of this world. He was there only because of a friend's insistence, someone who had assured him that this event would be a great opportunity to meet influential people, perhaps even open some doors for him. Edward knew he needed something, anything, to pull him out of his grim reality. His debts were piling up, his job barely covered half of his expenses, and the weight of failure seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. At 28, Edward felt like he was running out of time. He glanced at the other young men at the event, men his age, but with promising careers, expensive clothes, and imported cars waiting at the exit. They conversed with a natural confidence, as if the world lay at their feet. Edward knew that without something to change his situation, he would continue jumping from job to job, merely surviving rather than living. And he hated that. It was in this state of frustration that his eyes fell upon Vivian, a woman who, at first glance, seemed just another wealthy socialite attending a charity event. But something about her made Edward stop for a moment. There was an aura of power surrounding her, not the loud, arrogant power of someone flaunting their wealth, but a quiet certainty that came from having seen much in life and conquered even more. Vivian was known for her immense fortune. She had inherited a significant part of her late husband's business empire but had also built her own over the years. She was admired not only for her wealth but for her intelligence and her dedication to social causes. Yet to Edward, she seemed more than that. She appeared to be a ticket out of the life he despised. He needed an opportunity, and now, he believed he had found it. He watched her from a distance, surrounded by other guests who seemed enchanted by every word she spoke. They laughed and flattered her, but Edward noticed something in her gaze. She seemed distant, perhaps even a bit bored, despite the polite smile on her face. She was there physically, but her mind seemed elsewhere. She's not enjoying herself, Edward thought as he took a sip of his drink. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't the first time he had needed to use his charm to get something, and Vivian seemed like someone who could easily be won over, at least, that's what he thought. He waited for the right moment, watching as the crowd around Vivian slowly dispersed. When the last of her admirers moved away, he took a deep breath and decided it was time to approach her. He needed to impress her. He couldn't let this chance slip by. "Excuse me," he said with a rehearsed smile, confidently stepping forward. His hands were slightly sweaty, but he did his best to appear relaxed. "I couldn't help but overhear part of your conversation about the incredible work you do. It's truly inspiring." Vivian looked up at him, her clear eyes almost seeming to see right through him. She smiled faintly, but there was no surprise in her expression. She had met many like him before, young men eager to speak with her, often with ulterior motives. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "It's always nice to hear that my work resonates with the younger generation." She paused, studying him more intently. "And you? Are you involved in any causes?" Edward hesitated for a second. He had been prepared for more general questions, but now he needed to seem interesting. I'm trying to find my path," he said casually, adding a touch of vulnerability to his tone. "I've worked in a few places, but I feel like I haven't yet found what truly inspires me. But hearing about the work you do with underprivileged youth made me think I should get more involved in that kind of thing." Vivian studied him for a few more seconds. She knew there was more to his story, but she also knew that most people who approached her had hidden agendas. Still, there was something about Edward, a mix of ambition and desperation, that intrigued her. He seemed different from the other young opportunists she had encountered. "You have time, Edward," she said with a slight smile. "We're all trying to find our way in some form. Sometimes, opportunities come from the most unexpected places." Edward nodded, absorbing her words. He knew this was a subtle invitation to continue the conversation. He needed to proceed carefully. That's true. Sometimes what we need is right in front of us, but we don't know how to seize it. Vivian smiled again, a smile that conveyed both understanding and mystery. Exactly, she responded. But there's always a way, as long as we're open to seeing it. Those words echoed in Edward's mind. He knew he had to seize this opportunity. If he played his cards right, Vivian could be the golden ticket he had been waiting for. He was determined to see how far this connection could take him. Edward felt he was on the right track. His first interaction with Vivian had gone better than expected. With each passing day, he became more determined to gain her trust and, eventually, the fortune she represented. He needed to keep the plan moving. In the following days, Edward started appearing at events and meetings where he knew Vivian would be. Always impeccably dressed, he approached her carefully, initiating intelligent conversations and showing genuine interest in her philanthropic projects. He studied enough about the causes she supported to appear engaged, knew the right names to drop, and the right issues to discuss. To many, he seemed like a dedicated and promising young man, someone with a genuine interest in the social causes Vivian championed. Vivian watched his growing dedication with curiosity. He seemed to know a lot about what she valued, but something in his demeanor kept her on guard. Still, there was something about him that made her want to give him a chance. Perhaps it was his persistence or the charming way he carried himself, but Vivian began to develop an affection for Edward, something she hadn't expected. "You impress me," she commented one day, during a meeting of one of her charity committees. They were sitting at a more private table after spending much of the afternoon discussing plans for the next fundraising event. Edward smiled, pleased with his progress. He felt closer than ever to getting what he wanted. "Impress you? What did I do to deserve such a compliment?" Vivian crossed her arms with a light, genuine smile. "Not many young people your age are interested in philanthropy and social responsibility. You seem genuinely engaged. It's rare to see that combination of enthusiasm and understanding of what truly matters." He knew he had to nurture that thought. "I've always believed that people like us have an obligation to help those in need," Edward responded, almost believing his own words. "And I must say, working alongside you on these projects has been a life-changing experience. You inspire me, Vivian." She smiled, touched by Edward's apparent sincerity. Although a part of Vivian remained suspicious, she was starting to let herself be swayed by his charisma. He reminded her of her early years with her late husband when she still believed in the transformative power of youth. Edward seemed to have potential, and Vivian was willing to give him the opportunity to grow. Perhaps, over time, he could become someone worthy of her trust. "Have you ever thought about expanding your horizons, Edward?" she asked, looking out at the horizon through the large windows of the hall. "With your intelligence and adaptability, you could go far. Have you considered furthering your education, perhaps enrolling in a good university or getting involved in more challenging projects?" The question caught Edward by surprise. He hadn't seriously considered that. To him, the path to Vivian's fortune was clear: gain her trust, marry her, and secure financial stability for the rest of his life. However, it seemed Vivian wanted him to take a different route, one that involved effort and time. "Yes, of course," he lied, knowing he had to seem open-minded. "I've been thinking a lot about that lately. Maybe it's the next step I need to take." Vivian seemed satisfied with the response. "I know some people who could help guide you in the right direction. Maybe a business course or something that aligns with your interest in social causes. You have a lot of potential, Edward. It would be a waste not to take advantage of all the opportunities in front of you." Edward agreed, but internally, he wondered if it was all truly necessary. He was already getting close to his main goal, earning Vivian's trust and, eventually, her inheritance. Investing in formal education, even with the contacts Vivian could provide, seemed unnecessary. But he couldn't say that directly. He had to keep playing the game. "You're right, Vivian. I'm open to learning everything I can." In the months that followed, Edward accepted Vivian's invitations to attend social gatherings and meetings with influential people. She opened doors for him into circles he could never have entered on his own. He met business leaders, politicians, and public figures, all friends of Vivian, and began to be recognized as someone close to her. His public image started to change, and he was seen as an emerging figure in the worlds of business and philanthropy. Despite this, Edward remained focused on his original goal. He saw these new connections merely as a means to secure his place alongside Vivian. Her advice about education and personal development was something he continued to ignore. To him, Vivian's wealth was within reach, and he saw no need to follow the longer, more arduous path she seemed to suggest. Vivian, on the other hand, continued to believe in Edward. She saw in him a young man who could still grow and mature, someone who, with time and patience, could become worthy of her trust. She began thinking of ways to help him develop, offering him more than just money and status, but a real opportunity for change. Meanwhile, Edward continued playing his role, not realizing that he was wasting the true opportunities that were arising around him. His vision remained fixated on money, and that prevented him from seeing that the real wealth Vivian offered was far more valuable than he could ever imagine. The muffled sound of church bells echoed through the small chapel adorned with discreet and elegant flowers. Edward smiled faintly as he watched Vivian walk toward him. Dressed in a simple white gown, she exuded a serene calm, but there was a genuine expression of joy in her eyes. The wedding was an intimate event, without the ostentation many might expect from a woman of Vivian's wealth. She had always valued simplicity, and that's how she wanted her wedding day with Edward to be. For him, though, the moment meant more than just an emotional union. As he watched Vivian walk toward the altar, he couldn't help but think about what it represented. He was closer than ever to achieving everything he had ever wanted. The mansion, the money, the investments, everything she owned would soon be within his grasp. Edward kept a smile on his face, but his heart raced with the anxiety of knowing that his life was about to change dramatically. The few guests present clapped softly as the couple exchanged rings. Vivian smiled at Edward with an expression of tenderness and trust. She believed this marriage marked the beginning of a new phase for both of them. She had grown deeply fond of Edward during their time together, and more than that, she believed he still had much to learn and grow. Vivian saw his potential, even aware of his flaws. To her, the marriage wasn't just an act of love but also one of hope that Edward would become the person she knew he could be. In the months that followed the wedding, a new routine emerged. Vivian offered Edward even more opportunities. He was now included in meetings with investors, attended dinners and gatherings with influential businessmen and politicians. The doors were wide open for him. Vivian encouraged Edward to study more. She suggested he invest in a business course or even get involved in social impact projects, using the connections now at his disposal. "You have so much potential, Edward," she said one day during lunch at the mansion. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, gently illuminating Vivian's face. "I can see that you can do so much more. If you would only dedicate yourself a little, study more, you would go far. I have friends who can guarantee your admission to the best universities." Edward, who was absent-mindedly staring at his plate, nodded with a smile. He knew he had to keep pretending to be interested, but in his mind, the money was already almost in his hands. He saw no point in following the arduous path Vivian suggested. Go to college? Study business? All of that seemed unnecessary when, soon, he would have access to a fortune that would solve all his problems. "I've been thinking about that, Vivian," he replied softly. He was getting better at lying about his supposed interest. "I think it would be a good idea to invest in that. I'll definitely look into it." But the truth was, Edward was increasingly focused on the idea that with Vivian's fortune, he could finally live a carefree life. He viewed the opportunities she offered as an unnecessary burden, something he didn't need because he believed money would solve everything. To him, it was all just a matter of time, he just had to keep up appearances until he got what he wanted. Meanwhile, Vivian continued to believe that Edward was on the right path. She watched him with patience and affection, hoping he would eventually embrace the road to personal growth. She arranged meetings with renowned businessmen, presented him with business opportunities, and constantly suggested new courses or programs that could help him develop. She believed that, given time, he would realize there was more to life than just money. Edward, however, began to gradually distance himself from these opportunities. At dinners, while Vivian enthusiastically engaged with her influential friends, he would often zone out, thinking about other things. Sometimes, he didn't even bother to actively participate in the meetings or conversations that could have opened doors for him. To Edward, it all seemed unnecessary. The money was guaranteed, he thought, and all this talk about personal development felt like a waste of time. Vivian noticed Edward's growing disinterest, but she chose to believe that he was just tired or overwhelmed. She always saw the best in people, and Edward was no exception. She continued to encourage him, suggesting trips to explore new business ventures, new courses he could take, and even the possibility of taking on some responsibilities in her foundations. "You could make a huge difference, Edward," she would say with a hopeful smile. "With your knowledge and youthful perspective, you could really make an impact." Edward, for his part, continued his act. He smiled, nodded, and agreed with everything, but inside, all he wanted was for time to pass more quickly. Vivian's health seemed stable, but he knew she wasn't getting any younger. It was only a matter of time before the fortune was in his hands. Years passed, and Edward, now formally recognized as Vivian's husband, had established himself as part of that world. He was respected by those around him, but behind closed doors, he hadn't done anything to take advantage of the opportunities offered to him. He continued with the same mindset, waiting for the fortune. Vivian, on the other hand, continued to believe that he still had time to change. She clung to the hope that Edward, given the right opportunities, could still become the person she knew he could be. But, unfortunately for Edward, he didn't realize that he was squandering something far more valuable than money. The years passed slowly for Vivian and Edward. Their marriage had settled into a kind of silent agreement. They shared the same house, the same conversations about Vivian's projects, and, although he had entered the relationship with selfish motives, Edward had begun to feel something for her. It wasn't love in the way he had expected or imagined, but perhaps it was affection. They had become companions in routine, and though he still awaited the inheritance he believed to be his ultimate prize, there was a certain harmony in what they had built together. Vivian, on the other hand, knew that Edward had never abandoned his desire for her fortune. She knew him better than he realized. From the first moment they met, she had sensed his intentions, but there was something about him that made her believe that, perhaps, with time and the right opportunities, he could change. Though she had noticed that Edward had squandered many of those opportunities, she still held on to a fragile hope. In recent months, however, Vivian's health had begun to decline. At first, it was subtle, a cough that wouldn't go away, fatigue that seemed more frequent, a paleness that took over her delicate face. The doctors said that time was catching up with her, and though Vivian had been a strong woman throughout her life, her body was starting to weaken. Edward noticed it immediately. The signs were clear to him. The end was closer than ever. During breakfast, he would watch Vivian move around the room more slowly. Her once vivid gaze now seemed more distant, as if she were somewhere between the present and the past. The reality of the situation hit him. The fortune he had always imagined was finally within reach. Though there was a certain sadness about what was to come, Edward couldn't help but mentally prepare for what lay ahead. He had already done the math. He knew the value of each of Vivian's assets, from the stocks she owned to the mansion they lived in. It was only a matter of time before it all fell into his hands. Though he had developed some affection for her, he had never abandoned his original goal. Vivian, however, remained steadfast in her principles. She had never openly discussed her fortune with Edward. The will, the assets, these were things she had always treated as secondary, unimportant. To her, money was a means to help others, never an end in itself. And that, perhaps, was the greatest difference between her and Edward. She had always known how to use money for good, but he had always seen it as a solution to all his problems. One sunny afternoon, Vivian and Edward were sitting in the mansion's garden. The flowers around them swayed gently in the breeze, and the soft sunlight bathed Vivian's tired face. She knew she didn't have much time left, but rather than focusing on the end, she wanted to make the most of each moment. "Have you ever thought about what you'll do when I'm gone?" she asked suddenly, breaking the soft silence. Edward, caught off guard by the question, hesitated for a second. He didn't know how to respond without seeming insensitive, but he knew he couldn't lie to her at that moment. Vivian had always been honest with him, even when he didn't deserve it. I don't like to think about that," Edward lied, trying to maintain an appearance of sadness, but knowing that she could see through his words. Vivian smiled softly, as if his answer was exactly what she had expected. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, Edward. Sometimes, we spend years chasing something, and when we finally reach it, we realize that what really mattered has already passed us by." Vivian's words echoed in Edward's mind. He didn't know what she meant by that, but he felt a growing unease. He tried to push the thought aside, but in the days that followed, he noticed that Vivian's health continued to deteriorate. The family doctor began visiting more frequently, and Edward could feel the weight of responsibility closing in. Though he had dreamed of this moment, now that it was about to happen, he felt an odd emptiness. He wasn't prepared for the sadness that was beginning to settle over the house. The mansion, once full of life and activity, now seemed desolate, reflecting its owner's condition. The social gatherings that Vivian frequently organized were gradually suspended, and visits from friends and acquaintances became more and more infrequent. The house, which had once been a symbol of wealth and opulence, now felt like a reminder of something that was about to disappear. One day, after a long consultation with the doctor, Vivian asked to be alone with Edward. "I need you to know something," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've always known what you wanted from the beginning. I'm not naive, Edward. But over the years, you became more than that. You became part of my life." Edward felt a lump in his throat. Her confession took him by surprise. He had always known that Vivian was intelligent, but he hadn't imagined that she had been aware of everything from the start. "Vivian, She raised her hand, asking him not to interrupt. "Let me finish. I knew what you wanted, but I also knew that people can change if they want to. I really hoped you could find something more than what you were looking for. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't, I don't know. But now, time is running out, and what you do from here on is up to you." Edward couldn't respond. He knew there were no words that could justify his actions, and for the first time, he began to feel the weight of his choices. Vivian had known everything, and yet, she had chosen to give him a chance. But now, he didn't know what to do with it. Edward gazed at the mansion as the soft afternoon light faded into shades of orange. Since Vivian's death, the house had felt even quieter and emptier than before. Mourning was a strange sensation for him. Although he had known, on some level, that this moment would come, he hadn't been prepared for the mix of emotions that emerged. Over the years, Vivian had become a part of his life in ways he hadn't imagined. He had always known that his relationship with her was founded on selfish interests. But somehow, over the past few years, Vivian had become more than just an opportunity to him. She had been his companion, a constant presence, someone who had encouraged him to be more than he was, even though he hadn't followed the path she had laid out for him. Now she was gone, and the void she left behind felt as large as the mansion they had lived in. But despite the mourning, Edward knew there was a part of his life that would carry on. He still had the will, and with it, the future he had always planned. As he walked through the house, he allowed himself to think about everything he would do with the inheritance. He knew the mansion, with all its luxuries and history, would be his. He had already made plans to sell the property and use the money to travel, invest, and finally live the life he had always dreamed of. The anticipation began to build within him. How much would he receive, exactly? With Vivian gone, the fortune was now within his reach, and the anxiety mixed with a sense of accomplishment. He had missed many opportunities in life, but now he felt that the future was in his hands. When Vivian's lawyer arrived for the reading of the will, Edward felt a slight tension in his shoulders. He sat in a leather chair in the mansion's library, his heart beating slightly faster. The reading would be quick, or so he hoped. The lawyer, a formal and reserved man, calmly opened the folder of documents. Edward watched his movements as if, with each page turned, the fate of his life was being written. The lawyer began reading the will. With regard to the property, Mrs. Vivian's mansion will be donated to a charity, intended for the construction of a children's hospital, said the lawyer, his voice firm and emotionless. Edward blinked, confused. He felt a tightening in his chest, as if the words were some sort of mistake. The mansion wouldn't be his? It was impossible. He shifted in his seat, his discomfort growing. The hospital will be built on the site of the mansion, which will be demolished to make way for the new facility, the lawyer continued. Mrs. Vivian also allocated a significant amount to the construction and operation of the hospital. Edward's heart began to race. Demolished? The mansion would be demolished. How could that be? He felt the ground slipping out from under him. Everything he had imagined, the plans he had made for his future, were beginning to unravel. The lawyer went on, undeterred, while Edward could barely hear the rest of his words. Additionally, a significant portion of Mrs. Vivian's fortune will be donated to various charities, including religious organizations and programs supporting vulnerable youth. Each word was a blow. Edward felt as if he were being struck repeatedly. The charities, the philanthropic programs, it all made sense for anyone who knew Vivian, but not for him. There was no way this could be happening. The fortune was supposed to be his. That's what he had always believed, what he had waited for all those years. Then the lawyer paused, and Edward held his breath. He knew there had to be more. There had to be more. To Mr. Edward, Vivian's husband, the amount of $50,000 will be allocated for personal use. The silence that followed was crushing. The lawyer turned the page of the document, but Edward wasn't listening anymore. $50,000? That was the minimum she could have left him. Edward felt his head spin, as if he were losing his balance even while sitting. How could this be possible? He had waited years for this moment, and now all that was left was $50,000? That can't be true, Edward murmured, his voice hoarse with disbelief. He felt his hands sweating, his fingers trembling. She left me, only this? The lawyer, without changing his expression, closed the folder and looked at Edward seriously. These were Mrs. Vivian's final wishes. The amount allocated to you was specified by her personally. Edward couldn't believe it. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't accept this without question. Something was wrong, some mistake had been made. He needed to speak with the lawyer privately, to understand what had happened. The will couldn't be what he had just heard. I need more explanations, Edward said, trying to keep his composure, but his voice betrayed the desperation beginning to take over his body. I need to see the lawyer. This can't be all. The lawyer nodded, understanding Edward's state. Of course, Mr. Edward. We can schedule a consultation at my office so we can discuss the details of the will more calmly. Edward could barely think. Everything he had planned, the life he had imagined, was falling apart before his eyes. $50,000? It was a joke, an insult. He had spent the last few years waiting for something grand, but all he received was a symbolic amount. His mind was in chaos, and the only thing he could think was that he had to see the lawyer immediately. He needed to understand. Something was wrong, and he was going to find out what it was. The lawyer's office was austere, with dark wood furniture and walls adorned with diplomas and certificates. Edward felt a chill down his spine as he waited for the lawyer to finish organizing the papers on his desk. The room was silent, except for the soft sound of the lawyer's pen as he made notes in his files. Edward was still in shock. The reading of the will had left him completely disoriented. The mansion would be demolished, most of Vivian's fortune would go to charity and religious institutions. And he, who had spent years of his life waiting for this moment, had received only $50,000, a sum that, compared to what he had expected, was insignificant. The lawyer, noticing Edward's emotional state, interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Edward, the lawyer said, standing up from his desk and retrieving a white envelope from one of his files. Before she passed, Mrs. Vivian left this envelope for you. She said it contained her final message. Edward looked at the envelope with some hesitation. He didn't know what to expect. His mind was in a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, and a deep sense of defeat. What else could she have to say? He felt a mixture of curiosity and fear. He took the envelope with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the moment. "If you need anything else, I'll be here," the lawyer said, leaving Edward alone in the room so he could open the letter in privacy. Edward remained still for a moment, looking at his name handwritten on the envelope. The letters were soft, delicate, just as Vivian used to write in her daily notes. She had always been attentive to small details, something he had ignored most of the time. Now, the touch of her handwriting felt almost too personal, given the circumstances. He took a deep breath and opened the envelope. The letter inside was brief, but each word seemed to weigh heavily as he read. "Dear Edward, if you're reading this letter, it means my journey in this world has come to an end. I know that the reading of the will may have been a surprise to you, and perhaps you are disappointed with the choices I made. I want you to know that I never intended to cause you pain or suffering. Quite the opposite. From the moment we met, I knew your intentions. I was never naive about that. But over the years, you became part of my life, and I truly believed you could change, if you wanted to. I saw your potential, Edward, and I wanted to help you find it. That's why, throughout all this time, I tried to open doors for you, doors that, unfortunately, you chose not to walk through. I wanted you to see that money, by itself, isn't what truly matters. The real value lies in the opportunities we have to become better, to grow as people. I offered you those opportunities, and I hope that, as you read this letter, you realize that the true treasure wasn't in my fortune, but in what you could have built with your life. You still have time, Edward. You can still find your path. The $50,000 I left for you is enough to start fresh, if you so choose. But know that what you build from here on depends on your choices. Life doesn't hand you wealth, you must create value in what you do. I hope that, in some way, I have left a positive mark on your life. The choice now is yours. What will you do with the time you have left? With love, Vivian." Edward finished reading the letter in silence, Vivian's words echoing in his mind. He felt a tightness in his chest, something he couldn't quite describe. Vivian had known everything from the beginning. She had allowed him into her life, fully aware of his intentions, but still, she had believed in him. She had given him chances, opportunities to change, and he had wasted every one of them, blinded by the idea of easy fortune. He looked at the letter again, trying to process everything he had just read. Vivian's words hit him like a blow. All those years, she had tried to help him see the value in himself, tried to encourage him to develop, to seek something beyond money. And he, trapped in his greed, had been unable to see it. The opportunities he had ignored now seemed even more valuable. The doors Vivian had opened for him, the connections, the projects, all of that could have been his path to building something truly meaningful. But he had squandered every chance, waiting only for her death, to inherit a fortune he believed would be the answer to all his problems. Now, he had nothing. $50,000. That was all that remained. And though it was a considerable sum, it didn't come close to what he could have had if he had made the right choices. Edward felt crushed by the reality of his decisions. He had lost not only the fortune, but also the chance to be someone better. He could have learned, could have grown, could have become the person Vivian had hoped he would be. But now it was too late to correct the mistakes he had made. Or perhaps it wasn't. Vivian's final words still echoed in his mind. You still have time, Edward. Perhaps, in some way, he could find a new path. Perhaps he could finally take advantage of the opportunities that were still left. But at that moment, all he could feel was the emptiness of everything he had lost. Vivian's letter, with its kindness and hope, only deepened the pain of his own failure. He closed his eyes, feeling a wave of deep sadness and shame. He had waited years for a fortune, but in the end, the real treasure had always been in front of him, and he had been unable to see it. In the silence of his small apartment, Edward reflected on the months that had passed since the reading of the will. Vivian was gone, and the fortune he had waited for would never come. $50,000, that was all he had left, a sum sufficient for a simple restart, but far from the dreams he had nurtured. He looked at a photo of Vivian, her smile seeming to mock his choices. All those years, she had tried to transform him, to open doors for him to grow and become someone better. He had ignored it all. The life he had imagined was far from the reality he now faced. Now, it was too late to truly change. He had started studying, gotten involved in volunteer work, trying to build something with what remained. But deep down, Edward knew that regret would follow him forever. Vivian had offered him more than just a fortune, but he had only realized that when it was too late. He sighed, putting his course papers back into the folder. Vivian's lesson was clear: the value of life lay in the opportunities for growth, not in the money. Now, he would live trying to make the most of the new opportunities that would come. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.